Very good. Well, let's then come to today's webinar presenter, Dr. Nilesh Oak. Now, he has been a renowned researcher of Hinduism for several years. Internet is full of his lectures and his achievements. When I looked at it, and he's an expert on Hinduism and the origins of Ramayana and Mahabharata, and he has tried to do research on whether these very big, obviously, stories are true. What is the timeline? That's what he does the business in, and he is very hotly demanded all over the world. He just informed me he was in Boulder, Colorado, 2 months ago, and he travels quite a bit all over India as well as all over the world, uh, speaking about his research. So, without further ado, let me pass it on to Dr. Nilesh Oak to make his presentation. And once he does that, we'll be happy to have some questions about his presentations too. So, if nobody has anything else to say, I will pass it on to Dr.
Actually,
Oak.
I have a question of
Please.
Dr. Oak. I heard a rumor that the Indus script has been deciphered and the base language is Sanskrit. I don't know how authentic this is, and since you are in the field, perhaps you can say something about it.
Okay. Maybe I can, any other questions? Maybe I can just briefly start with that and get into the subject. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Professor Kulkarni, and thank you, Professor Parikh, for the question. That's not the main subject, but briefly, there are about 40 attempts, 40 plus attempts over the last 100 plus years in trying to decipher the Indus Valley script. Some of the names that might ring a bell for some of you is Professor Rajesh Rao at Washington University, like Seattle, where he and his team at least put forward analysis. This is a language, like the seals and the entropy calculations that they did. And there is another researcher that I am closely connected with. Her name is Sue Sullivan, or Sue Redalia Sullivan. She's based in California. And just out of her own passion, like she's just interested in languages. She has done this with many other languages, Elamite languages, Rongo script of Easter Island. But before she went to Easter Island script, she has worked on Indus Valley. She has published something called Indus Script Dictionary. And I wouldn't say it was like a conclusive thing, but definitely she showed the direction, just like Professor Rajesh Rao. And now recently, this Yajna Devam, that is the title he kind of uses, the proxy name, based out of America, and I know him well. But for his personal reasons, he doesn't disclose his real name. And so that's not even relevant. He seems to have made great inroads. So these all guys are consistent. For example, Sue Sullivan, her analysis showed that the language appears to be Sanskrit with a mixture of Prakrit, even Apabhramsha, and even sometimes some of the words from the southern languages like Telugu or Tamil. I'm not exactly sure. Now, some of you might have even heard the word of Iravatan, Mahadevan, and whatnot, Asko, Parpola, and many others. But this current one, Yajna Devam, what he's working on, that he has put forward his proposal, and now people need to come forward and analyze it, critique it, and it sits there right now. But with his claim that it is Sanskrit. And he's using a Paninian grammar. Again, I'm not a linguist, so I cannot talk much details, but he is using Paninian grammar and says that it perfectly does justice to that. With whatever limited, some 4,500 or 6,000 seals that we have, and we don't have a much longer script, as you may be aware. The longest one is possibly like 11 or some symbols, this board from Rangapur that was found. So with that, just want to get back to my subject. subject. And of course, this has a relevance in some fashion, but we may not have a time to go into that again. So let me share my screen. And just to save the bandwidth here, I'm sitting in Nasik here, and not sure how stable is the internet. So I will turn off
If I
my
can make
video.
one more comment.
Pardon me?
Actually, if I can make one more comment
Please,
relevant.
please go ahead. Yes.
Namely, that I was at one time very interested in the script. And I was visiting the Tata Institute in Mumbai sometime in the maybe 1978, 79. And they had they had the database of all the symbols, right? And so they gave me this tape. And when I returned to New York, I gave it to one of my former students who was then a doctoral student at NYU, and now she's an IBM fellow. And since she's a good computer scientist, I thought she might be able to say something. I'm hoping that that maybe she will correspond with you or with Mahadevan. But her name is Lakshmi Parida, and she's a very well known person, very senior at IBM. But she happens to be interested in this issue, and who knows? Let's hope. I find it hard to believe that it's Sanskrit, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Very good. And if you are in touch with her, if you can let her know that Yajnadevam has published a paper of his findings, and also he's active on Twitter. Like Twitter, has become like a good forum, like a Bharat Rakshak forum, if some of you were member of this. So definitely I would encourage her to get in touch with Yajnadevam. Very, very, very open person. I mean, I had a quick meeting with him when I was 2 months ago. I was in, traveling through US. So with that, I'm going to turn off my videos just to save the bandwidth.
If I may ask one question
Please.
also.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the board was found in Rangpura. Is that the same as Dholavira?
Yeah, it's the same as a Dholavira. In fact, the board is found at the Dholavira. Sue Sullivan's, what you can say, decipherment of read something like Ashuras of Rangapura. That is what she read out of it based on the logomorphic values she has assigned.
Really? Wow. Okay.
To those. Yes. In fact, see, I was working with her, meaning more on the audience as an audience member, but participating somewhat with 10 other members. This is going back 15 plus years. What convinced me, and with the limitations of the seals, that one seal, using the logomorphic values that she has assigned, not the circular logic, because that seal was not part of it. And it reads Ashwamedha something. And that was sort of like interesting for me. I said, now, like bringing these logomorphic sign values, like our ka, kha, ga, ga, na, whatever it is, and bringing them together to form a word Ashwamedha, that's like a bit more than a coincidence, and it's because some other words were found, like a 3-letter words like Naman, but that can be easily, reproduced. Like you can assign a certain values and repetitive, but Ashwamedha is a complex enough, and she has arrived at these individual space values, the sound values from something else.
You also mentioned Ashura. So this was also supposedly Asura province, maybe, or Asura people living there or something like that.
So well, I mean, again, we have such a limited information, but see, it could be the Asuras, but then Asuras becoming Ashuras, or if you look at the Syrians, like the Iraq and that area, and maybe their port, their colony, just like the Portuguese has a colony. I mean, it's open to interpretation, but it's very fascinating that she could literally get to Rangapur or Ashwamedh and so on. And so what I'm going to share is equally fascinating. Again, thank you everyone for joining. I do not know how much you are familiar with my work before, but I will not assume much, but please take some of the things with leap of faith if you are not familiar with my work at all. So let me just go through this. I'm going to turn off the video just to save the bandwidth. I'll turn it on again. I'm going to start sharing my presentation, and I'll go for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. and hopefully we have time for questions and answers. So if you can see my screen, revealing India's deep antiquity.
Yes.
And by way of like going into somewhat details, I will cover Mahabharata again very briefly. That is something I am researching since 1994. But if I have to summarize my work of say last 30 years or 30 plus years, specifically on the dating, like the timeline of Indian civilization, and frankly, therefore, in a way, a platform for understanding the world civilizations or humanities in general. Think of this, the horizontal line, the x-axis of time. Today is us right now, 21st century. Zero is like going back to the beginning of Julian Gregorian calendar, like 2000 years ago, connected with Jesus. And before that, the minus 5K is 5000 BC, 10,000 BC, 15,000 BC, 20,000 BC. Just as a summary, and I'll go into slight details on the Mahabharata, which is to say, I started with Mahabharata in 1994 with a one specific enigmatic reference from the Mahabharata text, and I'll tell that story in a minute. But once I solved the enigma behind it, then there are like a close to 300 astronomy descriptions, pieces of evidence, whatever you want to call it, from the text of Mahabharata itself. And just like we solve a jigsaw puzzle, crossword puzzle, they all come together and point to this specific date, 5561 BC. So think of this as 7,585 years, like 5561 plus 2024. But for our purposes, if we say 7,500 years ago, that's kind of sufficient. That's the year of Mahabharata War. Okay, that's based on the internal astronomy events of the Mahabharata. Now, in parallel, I was doing the same thing for Ramayana, but the success kind of came later, 14. And this 5561 BC Mahabharata dating came around 2009, 2010. I wrote my first book in 2007. And the Ramayana in 2014, where I showed very similar approach, that Ramayana, to my surprise, has close to 100 astronomy references, descriptions. And again, if you put together in a scientific fashion, like in a very objectively testable fashion, like repeatable, reproducible, and whatnot, they all point together, like solving a jigsaw puzzle, solving a crossword puzzle, or a combination thereof, to that specific year, 12,209 BCE. Again, that's the year of, think of this as a year of Ram and Yuddha. And for a specific reason, it just happens to be that year. And both of these have a mention of Vedas. So the next thing that Professor Balram, if you know him, he's based in Dartmouth, that's Massachusetts, and he used to be part of University of Massachusetts, and now on his own, started his Institute of Advanced Sciences, working on Indic studies, also botulinum, and that I am part of as adjunct faculty. So he asked me in 2017, he said, based on now what I've done on Mahabharata Ramayana, is there something I can do on Rigveda? Rigveda has astronomy references, but I did not quite find anything that kind of allows me to nail down a specific time, just like Mahabharata Ramayana. But there are river Saraswati references, which are very fascinating. And when you look at the geology evidence, like hydrology evidence, geophysics, geochemistry, morphodynamics of rivers, then we can say that definitely Veda are older than 21,000 years, 21,000 years, 21,000 BC, doesn't matter. It's not a specific time we are looking at. So just as a mnemonics, if you want to remember, think of a multiplication of 7 or 7,000, like more than 7,000 years ago from us, Mahabharata, more than 14,000 years ago, Ram. Definitely some portions of Rigveda more than 21,000 years, like just as a way of simply remembering it. So that's kind of a quick summary. What I want to do is take away some of the mystery as to how these things happen. So I'll start with the Mahabharata and then kind of speed through some of the very ancient, very antique evidence that actually we have access to. So the story of Mahabharata and me dating began in 1994. I was at the University of Alberta, just completing my master's in chemical engineering. And I went to the humanities library. Actually, like some of you, Professor Kulkarni, you may like this. I was just going to look for some kind of Marathi books are there, just out of curiosity. And I did find one, actually, some translations, like, for example, Garambicha Bapu, Garambi, or Bangarwadi of Venkatesh Madgulkar as Village Without Walls. And while I was going through that, as most of you are aware, especially American universities, if you go into that BL section, all the religions or individual countries, I saw the whole section, entire collection of the Bhandarkar Oriental Critical Research Edition of Mahabharata. So since I'm a student of Bhagavad Gita all along, just out of curiosity, I thought, let me see where exactly the Bhagavad Gita occurs in Mahabharata, namely the Bhishma Parva. I pulled the volume and I was just going chapter by chapter, waiting for that Dhritarashtra Vacha, Dharmakshetre, Kurukshetre. But I didn't get far. Actually, what happened is the first chapter, it's the beginning just before the war begins. The first chapter, second chapter, third chapter. And those second and third chapters are filled with these astronomy description that Vyasa is telling to Dhritarashtra, saying, hey, these are the things I'm seeing in the sky. And, he's the other non-astronomy descriptions also, and saying, Dhritarashtra, see, if you can make an attempt, convince your son to war. Of course, Dhritarashtra is convinced that they are going to win, and he gives all vague reasoning why he cannot do anything. That's not relevant. What is relevant is in that I came across a specific reference into the Bhishma Parva. Many astronomy, but the specific one fascinated me. And the reason it fascinated me is this. Just before I get to that reference, just to set the tone, number of you, all of you know, Mahabharata is about 100,000 verse long. If you look at the geography of Mahabharata from the context of who came to fight, just remember this for next 20 minutes, it will be relevant. We tend to think like everyone from India. Of course, they came from today's India, but don't forget, going back 7,500 years ago, the current Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, possibly Cambodia, Vietnam, parts of Indonesia, Thailand, in the east, or in the west, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, some of the countries to the north of India, like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, which is considered Uttara Kuru, Uttara Madra, going all the way to Syria, Baltic. So there were people who coming from different areas, and that's not a subject today, but we have enough evidence in Mahabharata, but also Ramayana geography evidence that some of these kings came from Iran, parts of Syria, Turkey, and so on. Okay, keep that in the mind when I look at the genetic evidence eventually. But so that's just the landscape here. A bit more to digest. But specific astronomy reference that I came across was this something now become very famous called Arundhati Vasishta, or AV observation. And what Vyasa is telling Dhritarashtra just day before the Mahabharata is this star Arundhati, Saptarshi, the Saptarshi Mandal, we have the 4 rectangular stars and then 3 tail stars in the sky. And the there is a Vasishta. I presume, I will assume right now that you know the Saptarshi stars, the 7 stars, the Ursa Major in the northern hemisphere. And the middle star is called Vasishta, into the tail. And next to that, there is a very small star, like a magnitude of about 5 and 6. And it's called Arundhati. In the Indian astronomy, Vasishta and Arundhati. In the modern astronomy, Alcor for Arundhati and Mizar for Vasishta. And what Vyasa is saying that Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishta. Now, why this is such an interesting reference? It is interesting reference because if you look at the sky today at night, you're going to find Vasishtha is walking ahead of Arundhati. And this Saptarshi star combinations is such a stable combination. In fact, that's why it is famous around the world, goes by, it was used for navigation and whatnot. And it's an extremely stable combination with a very low proper motion. I mean, that's an astronomy term. Of you may be already familiar. If not, just take it on a Shraddha for now. So it's like, there is nothing. Sorry.
I'm in a kind of meeting now. I know. That's why अभी मैंने आपको थोड़ा ऐसा करते मैं हमारा चाय बना रही हूँ तो आपके लिए
Sorry, Ravinder ji, can you mute, please?
Yeah. Actually, you can mute him too. List.
Okay.
Just go to the.
Okay, I will continue.
After this.
Yeah.
But I can mute,
but as a host, Nilesh, as a host, you can mute him too. So.
Right. But let me.
Yeah, just mute Ravindra Kulkarni.
Okay.
And he will fine. Okay, we got it.
Okay, all right.
Sorry about that.
No, that's right. So sorry, all guys who are listening, please, if you keep your phones, I would truly appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So okay. So this Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha. That is not the case today. And astronomically, this was not to be such an impossible thing that, likes of, let's say, Lokmanya Tilak, everyone knows that. The great Indian astronomer Shankar Balakrishna Dikshit, Lele Shastri, P.V. Kane, C.V. Vaidya, some of the great guys like Bharatacharya C.V. Vaidya, Bharat Ratna P.V. Kane, when they did analyzed all the dating for Mahabharata, there are more than like 130, 140 over the last 400 years, both in the West. They said this is impossible in the very order of nature. Like, astronomically, this is not possible. And even I was fascinated and I thought like, well, but why did Vyasa? And I said, what if this is possible? Okay, so that's like a stumbling on a problem that you think is impossible to solve. And I said, maybe my youngish years, I would say, this is something I want to try as an engineer. And frankly, I thought I'm going to solve this in a couple of weeks because I had that much time to defend my thesis and then start my job in Canada. Well, actually, I did succeed, except I did not succeed in those 2 weeks, not in the 15 days, what I had thought. In reality, it took me 15 years from 1995 or 1994 to 2009. But finally, and I'm going to skip the astronomy complexity for you. I mean, that will itself take a long time. But finally, when I did succeed in 2009, this is what the outcome is. The astronomy outcome that's very scientific, very logical. Anyone can go and check with a very basic knowledge of astronomy that it says such a phenomenon actually did exist. It was possible, it did exist. But between the time limit that you are saying, only after 1191 BCE and before 4508 BCE. So now think of the scientific model triangulation, explanation, prediction, testing in the context of a theory, in the context of background knowledge. My theory being astronomy descriptions of the Mahabharata text are descriptions of Mahabharata times. And this is one of the description that Vyasa is saying. What it's saying is the way Vyasa describes to Dhritarashtra the position of Arundhati and Vasishtha, that could only be seen that Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha is only between these two dates. So a time interval of about 6,000 years. Now fast forward by so basically what this says, observation is true and made at the time of Mahabharata War as given in the Mahabharata text. Then Mahabharata War did not happen any before 11,000 BCE, and it did not happen any time after 4500 BCE. That's how the conclusion would be. Now fast forward to say 10 years, and there is another guy, his name is Siddhartha Chabra. He's based in Michigan, and he felt like testing my claim to see if there is any substance or he validate. And so he used latest data meaning that was available at 2019, like more refined data over the period of 10 years. Like Jet Propulsion Lab, NASA, Hubble telescope, whatever that comes down, dated into this software otherwise. And essentially validated and say, yeah, that's true, except the dates that I had figured out. He actually came up with a more precise data, a shorter in like 10,248 BC to 4636 BC. Still, the argument being, yes, this observation is valid and it is possible and in the shorter interval. So now the next question is, what do we do next? I mean, still we are left with like 5,000 year time to figure it out. So I'm going to quickly show you how I arrived at 5561 BC. But see, this is just one observation out of 300 plus that I mentioned. So for example, Bhishma Nirvana, I will not take time because I want to go through some additional juicy matters and I wrote a whole book on this. But Bhishma Nirvana, most of you know that Bhishma was the general from the Kaurava side, and he fought for the first 10 out of the 18 days of the war. And on the 10th day, he fell down in the battle, but did not die per se. I mean, he has this specific siddhi, as Mahabharata describes, that Ichha Maran, he can decide when he wants to go. On the bed of arrows, supposedly waiting for the day of winter solstice. Now, if you look at all the evidence from the Mahabharata text and look at from the astronomy point of view, then this is, I'm just going to jump into a quick conclusion. There's tons of evidence, actually close to 100 plus data points that tells you the chronological, astronomical configurations that are related to this Bhishma Nirvana entire event connected with God. And a certain piece of it will tell you that, hey, look, this has to happen, this Bhishma Nirvana, the way it's described based on evidence, sometime after 7000 BC, before 4700 BC. And if you keep on refining it, that actually you can narrow down this interval to 1500 time interval, 67 BCE to 5125 BCE. So now from 6000 to 5000 down to, I have reduced that interval 1600 years. Okay. Still, it's a big challenge as to how do we figure it out to a specific year, like say 5061 BCE, or are there multiple solutions? Fortunately, the same Mahabharata text, like, think of all the planets that we know, like a Mercury, of course, Sun and Moon, but then Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. And there are close to like 50 descriptions for these 5 planets, also Sun and Moon, so that's 7. And by the way, Mahabharata or Ramayana do not refer to Ketu per se. They just refer to both nodes as a Rahu. Okay, in both texts, it is like that. So Rahu, we'll take Rahu for example. And so we have that node also. And there is this, now this is not astrology, this is astronomy. So again, if we get a time in a question answer, then I'll give you certain evidence, like how does it look? For example, the Arundhati evidence, the way it is given in Mahabharata goes like something like this. Ya Chaisha Visuta Rajas Trailok Adu Sammata Arundhati Tayapesha Vasishta Prushtata Kruta. Arundhati has placed her husband behind, and that's the language. And here, if you have to look at Saturn and Jupiter, it will go something like Samvatsarasthainancho Graho Prajulito Ubho Vishakhayo Samipasto Brahaspati Shanescharo. Like Brahaspati and Saturn and Jupiter are in the vicinity of Nakshatra Vishakha for up to a year, shining very brightly, which is to say they are going retrograde. And very, very specific descriptions for Mars, Venus, Mercury, and these planets, and multiple descriptions for each planet. And that kind of, allows us to solve this as a jigsaw puzzle, crossword puzzle. And basically this, what I'm showing you on the screen, is finally takes you to 5561 BC. Just I'll make one point. As a scientific approach, we must include all the evidence that is available. We cannot exclude any, because then if something doesn't match, we have to say, hey, these 2 points do not match. But we must test everything, because the theory says, theories has to be very generic and universal. But in reality, suppose by, and I was not so lucky, but suppose by luck, if somebody looks at only the Mars evidence. So if you look at this Mars here, for example, so there is a description of Mars as retrograde. There is a description of Mars as going oblique, and there is a description of Mars going Vakri into these multiple places, all of places. So if you just look at the Mars evidence, like there are 8 pieces of descriptions in Mahabharata text, and only those are capable of taking you to 5561 BCE. All I'm trying to tell you is how robust is this evidence. Now, instead of Mars, let's say you take only Saturn and Jupiter, like there are a total of 10 descriptions together. And to that, let's say you add something else than Mars. Let's say you add Venus to it. Then again, it's going to take you to 5561 BCE. And of course, you take all of these, there will take you to 5561 BCE. So that's how robust it is. And so that's how I figured out. And just now I'm showing you that approach. So my theory is that all descriptions of Mahabharata text, astronomy ones, are astronomy descriptions of Mahabharata times. So then I read Mahabharata like 30 times in the whole process, forgetting all the stories, just focusing on anything, anything it says related to astronomy, seasons, nakshatra, planetary positions, eclipses, you just name it, even a tithi, nakshatra, whatnot. Just I extracted. That amounts to about 30, or even chronological descriptions, like how long Bhishma is on the bed of arrows and so on. And then you objectively state. So the way I tested is using astronomy, like mathematical hand calculations. But by the time I was into, like, say, 2005, they're extremely sophisticated, and there are now astronomy software, like, say, Carina Soft, based out of California, very, very sophisticated. And so they make the job easier, but still you could do it either by mathematical calculation or actually simulation. You can cross-validate. So you take a evidence like, say, like, the Sanskrit shlok I read, then you take the meaning and you try to test it here, and then you draw the conclusion, like, at this. And as a background, now you're assuming understanding of modern astronomy to be valid, but also the identification of Indian astronomy in the Mahabharata text, and so on, and this for translations. So this is the doubt clearing machine. You start with the problem, like when did the Mahabharata War happen? You propose a theory and then go through this. And essentially, I use the same approach for Ramayana. But now I want to tell you something very interesting that happens. This is called a tetradic. Again, I mean to preach to you. I mean, you are all in academia. Like, you would have heard about it, the tetradic schema of the scientific method, or in a simple language, no good work goes unpunished. So my problem is P1 is like, when did the Mahabharata War happen? My tentative theory is like, I'm saying, well, my theory is all astronomy descriptions of Mahabharata text are descriptions of Mahabharata times. And so what is it saying? It's saying Arundhati has to walk ahead of Vasishta. So that took me 15 years. But finally, when I succeeded, I said, yeah, in between this time interval, I can show Arundhati walking ahead of Vasishta. So that's like a EE, error elimination. And then, of course, I did this for all the 300 plus astronomy observations, and that points to 5561 BCE. Now, what? I mean, are we done? Well, usually that's never the case. I mean, if you look at the entire modern science development since, say, Copernicus, last 500 years in the Western world, Western Europe, like Copernicus, set sun at the center instead of Ptolemy, and orbits are circular. Then Kepler comes and says, sun at the center is fine, but the orbits are not circular, they are elliptical. And then Newton comes and says, well, why they are elliptical? Like, F equal to ma. And then Maxwell would say something, Faraday would say something, Lagrange would talk about the three-body problem. Then Einstein comes and says, hold on, there is some problem, actually something else. And it just goes on. So this is one route you make a progress. But which is because it leads to problems, the P2 of more problems of higher complexity. So what I want to do is show you just related to Mahabharata. So fine, astronomy is taking me to the 5561 BC. But one may ask, is there any other discipline of science that we can possibly test, or do we have an ability to test? And that also seems to corroborate this 5561 BCE. And so there are like about 20 areas that I have explored. I'm quickly going to show you 2. And then I'm going to just fast forward through a deep line, and then we can get into question answer. So for example, all of you would remember that Krishna's Dwarka, that was flooded and destroyed by gushing sea waters. And Mahabharata says it happened after the Mahabharata War. And actually it tells you a very specific time. It says 36 years after the Mahabharata War. So we start with that P1 TTEE, like based on astronomy evidence. Yes, 5561 BC is the year of Mahabharata War. 36 years after that is what? 5561. And actually we have to subtract because we are looking at the before Common Era. So that to 5525 BCE. So now this is very interesting. So go back to the doubt. So first, when I started, what is the year of Mahabharata War? And now in the second round, I know the year of Mahabharata War. I actually know the predicted year for flooding and destruction of Krishna's Dwarka, which is 5520 BCE. Before I knew the years from the Mahabharata text, like the 300 descriptions. But now I'm asking, is there any ground evidence for flooding and destruction of Krishna's Dwarka? Like, you can call it archaeology. Astronomy is also archaeology, but here I mean on the ground. So that is what I was working on after 2011, after I published my first book. So in my first book, there is whatever I'm now is not there because, I only stopped where I could come up with 5561 BC. And frankly, it's very important what evidence you find for flooding and destruction of Krishna's Dwarka in 5525 BC. This is like Zarin's paper, 1998, I think, somewhere there, but about 25 years ago. The data that I'm going to quickly show you, but it comes from the west coast of India, like the whole Arabia, frankly. What you have is not easy to read, but the x-axis is time. And so imagine x-axis is like, to the right, it's 2000, like where we are today, going backwards to 0. And as you go to the left, we are going to 1000 BC, 2000 BC, and so on. The vertical red line that I have drawn, I have drawn that exactly at 5525 BC, because that's my predicted year for Krishna's Dwarka. And what does this evidence shows you? The y-axis is the increase in the sea level. So this curve that you are seeing is the changes in the sea level. And if you look at right in the middle of 6th millennium BCE, where the vertical red line is, actually you see a sudden sea level rise of about 15 meters. Just imagine 15 meters. So about 50 feet. And if you go additional 200, 300, 400, 500 years, maybe even up to 1,000 years, you see further additional 8 meters, total of 23 meters sea level rise. So very sudden sea level rise in the Arabian Sea, and that's where the Dwarka is. So that is our first evidence. Just while I'm at that point, I want to make one more point. Like, I forgot the name now, but one professor asked, like, is this the board found at Dholavira, for example? Now, something just very interesting. See, this horizontal line here that you see in the graph is the mean sea level, which is the sea level today. But notice what happened. When this middle of 6th millennium sudden sea level rise occurred, we're not going to why it occurred this time during question answer. Notice what happened. Actually, sea level rise went above today's mean sea level by about average 3 meters. Like here, say, like think of this as a 5000, 4000 BCE. And notice it's that way for the next 2000, 2500 years until 2000 BC. Now this, if you pay attention, this will tell you, you can go and check Google afterwards. Why think of places like Dholavira or Lothal in Gujarat? Why they were ports? Now, the answer is right here. Of course, there are some other factors like land subsidence and whatnot, or land upliftment. But the main thing is the actual sea level about 5000, 4000 BC in the Gujarat or the West Coast area was higher than what it is today. So the ocean water was much closer to Dholavira and Lothal. And then you can see why they were ports. And if you check their timing, you will see that they were ports about 4000 BC to 2000 BC. No surprise here. Actually, this gives the answer. Now the question is this the only data point? I mean, if it is the only data point, still it is impressive. But we are fortunate, we don't depend on this one data point. In fact, there are data points around the world, 30 plus data points spread throughout the world. And if you go to the southern side, or southern hemisphere, and including America, the Caribbean, whatnot, even Mediterranean, like say the formation of a Black Sea. Even you see the evidence in France, Netherlands, and whatnot. But India, the West Coast, but if East Coast, Pumpuhar, Indonesia, Great Barrier Reef, Vietnam, again, I have like about 20 videos just on this, like each day point I'm taking and going through it. But phenomenal evidence, very consistent, powerful evidence for a sudden sea level rise in the middle of 6th millennium BCE, and that is that 5525 BCE. Okay, so very, very powerful evidence supporting that. In fact, there is evidence in this, I'll not go because of time, coming from Indonesia, which actually convincingly shows that there, because most of us, if you remember, most of us, us meaning not just those on the call, but around India and the data in the last 150 years, many people think Mahabharata happened about 5,000 years ago. Well, there is not even a single piece of evidence in the entire astronomy descriptions of 300, not even one that will take us anywhere near 3000 BC plus minus 1000 years. But this is not limited to astronomy evidence. This is also true about the ground evidence, like oceanography evidence. In fact, this evidence from the Dwarka that I just showed you, like Arabian Sea, but also from Pumbuhar, which I have no time to go right now, but also from Indonesia, it decisively says there was no sea level rise anywhere 3000 BC. In fact, if anything, it was going down. Okay, so that's a very decisive evidence to falsify anyone claiming Mahabharata war based on astronomy or archaeology or oceanography evidence around 3000 BC minus 1000. Quickly, I want to share the genetics ones. Now, if you are not on the mute, some of the questions you may answer. Anyone remembers how many warriors fought in the Mahabharata war? So keep it in mind that Mahabharata war happened 7,500 years ago. If you read the description, 18 aukshohini, that is the Sanskrit word. Think of equivalent to or some military formation, like a company. Those many warriors fought, and if you look at the Mahabharata description, that 18 aukshohini amounts to about 40 lakhs warriors. Okay,
My goodness.
4 million. Yeah.
That's quite a bit. I thought it was in thousands, but yeah, this is...
No. 40 lakh, 4 million. And
wow.
Afterwards, if you have a worry like, oh my God, how did they fight? We will answer that, but don't get stuck because you will miss the juicy part. Now just like we have a earthquake. So anytime an earthquake happens, we immediately ask the three questions. We say, when did it happen? When did it happen? As in like an epicenter. And we say, how strong was it? Like, what was the Richter scale? I want you to think of that as a metaphor for this Mahabharata war, and remember, the population that time, the net population was much lower. We don't know that number. I mean, if you go to Google, you can find estimates from 2 million to 50 million, but that's very, very wide type of estimates. But the point is, the population was much smaller. So 4 million would be a second portion, whatever it is. Now, keep in mind, I ask you to remember where the warriors have come from, possibly as far west as Syria and as far east as, say, Indonesia, everything in between, and even the north to Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and so on, the Uttara, Madhya Uttara, Kuru, Afghanistan, and all that area. And now what I'm showing you here is a Monica Carmin paper. It's a genetics paper that came out in 2015. And so quickly, what is the x-axis? Time. Start on the left side, right side with a 0, which is us now, and then go back all the way to 150,000 years of all the genomic data. And then, of course, there is a modeling in it. The y-axis, now just pay attention, bit technical if you're not into genetics. Y-axis is a ratio of a female chromosomes variation to male chromosomes variation, like NF over NM. And I'll explain that a little bit. But just on this graph, think what is happening. When nothing extraordinary is happening, like this solid peak here or another peak or another going there, what do you see? The noise. In fact, let me see if I can draw the noise here. Think of this as a signal to noise type of discussions. My signal, where it is happening. Okay. If I bring the time down, it comes down to 7,500 years ago. That's the tallest peak there. Which is to say, suddenly there is a evidence of a male chromosomes bottleneck, like a Y chromosomes bottleneck. Like suddenly the variety of the variations, the vividhata, we can say, in the male chromosomes went down. The female chromosomes has not gone up because of the ratio. It appears as if it has gone up, but it is the male chromosomes variation that has gone down. And how much it has gone down? If you look at the ratio, it's like a 17:1 on an absolute scale. Or if you look at the signal to noise ratio, so think of this. If nothing is exciting happening, then the noise about what? About between 3 and 4. And I'll explain in a minute where that noise comes from, in why it is 3, for example, or why it is between. Take an absolute scale, it's 16:1, 17:1. On a relative scale, it is about 5. Like think of 17 divided by 3 point something. Keep that in the mind for a second. So let me explain this noise. Also remember where it is happening. That bottleneck is happening about 7,500 years ago. So think of this as a genetic earthquake. The Richter scale equivalent is like 16:1 or 5:1 on the scale. When is it happening? 1,500 years ago. And we also have to answer the question, where is it happening, or what is the epicenter? Before that, just so that you understand where this ratio comes from, it's a signal to noise ratio. Think of this. When nothing is happening, a man and a woman, like, a couple. So we have, naturally, there are about 3 X's and a 1 Y. That is that noise, the X to Y ratio. The female variation to male ratio typically, generally is about 3:1. I mean, it's going to vary a little bit. So that is that noise. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. That's what it is given here. Now, one question I did answer. I answered how serious was this genetic earthquake, 16:1 or 5:1. When did it happen? 7,500 years. That's what Monica Carmen's paper says. The last question is, what was the epicenter? Now, this is a very good graph, but just I want you to focus on these colors. So Asia is like India. So focus on that. And notice this is our control group, this horizontal line at 1.0. And we're looking at the deviation from it, So this deviation that you see is that dark green, forest green line, which is India, the South Asia. Notice it is the first one to see the significant drop. Okay, that dark green line. The first one to see the drop. The one that stayed at that bottom, the change bottleneck, the longest, and the last to come out. If you can follow that. And then I want to quickly show you 2 more colors. And actually, I will show you one more. The next one, think of going to the west of India, Near East, which is like, think of this as a Middle East. That orange color here, that is the second one that has seen the effect. And frankly, it came back very fast. The next one is the Southeast Asia, which is, think of east of India. That is this blue line that has seen the effect. It did stay longer at the bottom, but did finally come out, meaning, there is a balancing and the effect of that bottleneck is kind of gone long before it happened in India. And quickly, Europe, I'm going to show you for a very interesting reason, the yellow color. Now notice, it's the exactly same signature that you see in the Europe also and Central Asia also, but just focus on Europe for a minute. Except the line, if you notice when it is happening, see, India is happening here. Okay, it starts showing here. This is because of modeling, and we can get into that question answer. Because there are no data points available, you can connect by a straight line or a concave curve or curve. But notice the yellow line for Europe, it has the same signature like a male Y chromosomes bottleneck, but delayed by about 2,000, 3,000 years. So just remember that. So if you have to answer, is this Y chromosomes bottleneck occurred? It happened, the epicenter is India. It happened 7,500 years ago, and basically it was a male bottleneck. And now I'm saying that connects very well with 4,040 lakhs exclusive male, 99.99% of them dying in less than 18 days, and the subsequent effect on the progeny. So now there are very few variety of men producing the children post Mahabharata War. Okay, and this is Monique Carmin paper, by the way, that came out in 2015. There are a couple of papers written, one in Stanford. Actually, I was there in Stanford August, and I tried to meet with those authors. I could not meet them. I happened to be there on a Saturday, so maybe because of that. But very, very interesting conclusions. Again, if you get time, I'll go through that. But what I want to show you is just show you two pieces of evidence, one from genetic, one from oceanography. But actually, you can show this for about 10 to 15 additional sciences. Just I'll give a list like geography, geology, geophysics, geochemistry, oceanography. But we can do the same thing for climatology. We can do the same thing for sedimentology. I already covered genetics. But we can also show this for physical topology, and then genealogies, and the relative referencing between Ramayana and Mahabharata, which is to say, Ramayana references occur in Mahabharata, but vice versa is not true, and that's how it ought to be, and so on. So we can actually validate this, cross-referencing from sciences, but also from the Indian text between them. Okay, so this is just a quick summary. What I want to show you now quickly, and I will end in like 5 minutes here, is this the end? So, okay, even if, let's say, people analyze this and validate for themselves, and now they are convinced, just like I am, and many others are around the world now, after 15 years. But is that the end of it? I mean, is there something can go on in a very mathematical, very precise format? Actually, there are some. For example, if you look at the descriptions of Nakshatra in Ramayana, but also Mahabharata, they are actually identical. So then the question comes, the current nakshatra system, and that is they are identical to what we use, by the way. So like last 14,000 years, essentially we are using the identical nakshatra system. Now that's fascinating. So the question I had in the same tetradic schema format, P1, TT, EE, P2, like, is there a way we can find out when was the formation of the current nakshatra system? So there might have been a nakshatra system before, but what is there a way to find it out? And actually, we are lucky to find that answer. The clues come from different texts. They come from Mahabharata, they come from Ramayana, they come from Rigveda, but they also come from our astronomy texts, such as Aryabhatiya and Siddhanta. And they point to about 30,000 years ago, about 28,000 BCE, which is when the current nakshatra, 27-28 nakshatra system, including Abhijit that we use, was formed. That's not to say there may not be a nakshatra system before that, but there is enough reason to believe that the current nakshatra system that we use, or the one that exists in Mahabharata or Ramayana, was definitely formed around this time frame, 30,000 years. Then somebody says, okay, that's fine. What about any other event like Ramayana or Mahabharata, like a historical, ऐतिहासिक event? Well, we don't have any historical text besides, ऐतिहासिक text besides Ramayana and Mahabharata that has survived at least. But we do get stray references. For example, this is from Samaveda tradition, Maitrayani Upanishad or Maitrayani Aranya. And there is a reference quoted to many kings of Ikshvaku dynasty. There is one king, Brahadrat. And what is very interesting, I'll make it short just to manage time, that he is referring to some astronomy phenomenon. He's saying the bright pole star is moving. He also says that the vernal equinox is in a nakshatra Magha. But something very interesting, he says that the oceans are drying up. He says many other geological phenomenon, but one of the key one is oceans are drying up. Now, if you look at the graph here, we start with our times and go backwards and try to find out when was the time, say, vernal equinox was in Nakshatra. So starting with our times, we get the first instance going backward is about 10,000 years ago, like 8141 BCE, when vernal equinox was in Mag. Only problem with that is when it was a 8141 BCE, the ocean levels were rising and they were not drying up. Last 20,000 years, oceans are coming. So that cannot be it. And so now if you go back through the precession of the Earth's axis, 26,000 year cycle, we come to this 34,000 BCE. And actually all the descriptions that King Brihadratha is giving in Maitrayani Aranyak, actually they fit this particular time, like 34,500 BCE. So actually you can almost take, I'm just using this as a simple mnemonics, like multiplication of 7, 7, 21, 28, 35, and on. I'm just going to quickly go like a few more and show that there are some things that are happening. Say, for example, in hydrology, Saraswati was a grand river, some places as wide as 26 kilometers. That is the modern evidence telling us, evidence of last 35, 40 years. Very, very precise, very accurate evidence coming from close to 200 different publications, both in India, most of them outside India, about northwest river of India. But Yamuna is telling us that Yamuna started separating from Saraswati about 50,000 years ago, and about 40,000 years ago that was complete. Now, this has great implications for Ramayana timing because, some people in our sort of a religious tradition believe Ramayana happened million years ago. This evidence says that's not possible because Ramayana talks of Yamuna meeting Ganga, and the geology evidence tells us that happened only in the last 50,000 years, So there is some very fascinating evidence that comes to help us. Or for example, just like we had this tall peak 7,500 years ago at the time of Mahabharata, what was possibly happening here 56 years ago? We don't know exactly because we don't have sufficient evidence to connect the dots, but some speculation I wanted to put there. And those are, for example, this be the Dasharatnya Yuddha that was discussed in Rigveda. I'm not saying it is, I'm just raising possibilities for somebody to research it further. Evidence exists. Or could it be the Parshurama, who's getting rid of the miscreants, like, the wayward Kshatriyas 21 times? Could it be that? We don't know that, but that's what the possibility could be. And then I'll quickly jump to 70,000. This is a Toba explosion that, happened in the Sumatra, and it blanketed entire India, the greater India of that time. And significant population was wiped out. But the evidence that we have does tell us, like this is the Jwalapuram in Andhra Pradesh, like you see, this is all red, but in between the ash layer, the remote, and that goes to that 70,000 years of this explosion. Interestingly, they have found the stone tools below the ash layer, and they have found stone tools above the ash layers. So this is not to say that these were the Rigvedic peoples, but the point being, there were these human beings. They were there in India at that time before Toba explosion. They were there after Toba explosion, which is to say some of them did survive because the tools are identical, before Toba explosion and after Toba explosion. And this is me working with about 20 different researchers. Most of us, by the way, are like, what you can say? We have our different profession, like say I'm a chemical engineer and a consultant, the power industry and food industry and whatnot. Like Rupa Bhati, she's an architect by profession, but there are 20 others, like some computer scientists, whatnot. Just like Yajna Devam, for example, working on the linguistics and IVC. There are about 20, I'm saying approximately. Anil Narayanan from ISRO, working on astronomy along with us. And we could put together, and this is something for all of us to explore, evidence coming from different fields within Indian context, taking us back to at least 75,000 years. And there are some researchers like Michael Petraglia, who is going further back within India, going back to 2 lakhs years and even 1 million years. But keep in mind, as we go back, the evidence gets less and less. But it's very, very evidence going back to 75,000 years. So on that, I want to stop. But quickly, if you had some question, I wanted to say, hey, whether people think there was an ice age. What about ice age? Quickly, I want to say, well, ice age was in the North America and Northern Europe. As far as India was concerned, yes, there were somewhat cooler temperatures, but actually it was like a very natural air conditions. Like, the weather conditions were amazing. And same thing for Indonesia and Africa and Mexico and Colombia and so on. Actually, great things. In terms of water, we had a water, actually, we have evidence of Saraswati flowing beautifully for 2 lakhs plus. This is James Blinkhorn's work and many other researchers, about 50. But so we had rivers, especially Northwest India, entire India, but Northwest India included, flowing beautifully through this so-called ice age of Europe and America. So the reason I'm mentioning is because I get these questions. Hey, what if we are freezing, how come there was a civilization? About agriculture, people may be surprised. Not many people know this, but there is evidence for a agriculture, wild harvesting, storage, cooking, whatnot, going back to Sri Lanka. And remember that time back now, I'm going to tell you 45,000 years in the past. Actually, the Sri Lanka and India were connected. Okay, so it's a part of India at that time. So there is evidence for harvesting, storage, at least the wild harvesting. They may not be planting. And if you look at the agriculture centers, you will find India, China be the significant ones, not just the Levant, and also in the Peru, the Mexico, and so on and so forth. But something, I don't know if you guys were aware, so if you look at the domestic mouse, which is directly connected to agriculture because of a settled civilization, and that's where the rectus, or what we call the wild rat to the domestic occurs. This is a Bonhamy paper 2007. What you find is all the domestic varieties of mice around the world, if genetically, if you try to find their coalescence, like where they originally possibly came from, or is there a single origin, surprise, surprise, actually you find a single origin and their home happens to be India. Just look at the arrows, where they start and where they are going out. This is Bonhamy paper 2007. And in terms of estimates, there are varying estimates from 300,000 years, like 3 lakhs years, down to like 20,000 years. So I've taken the most conservative one. And this is a spread of agriculture, by the way. Ditto for the zebu cow and so on, but I want to just go fast. And now there are some papers, which is say like, maybe, not maybe, we know that the human beings came out of Africa, at least that is current theory. There are theories now for multiple origins of human beings and so on, but I'll not go into that. But even when the Homo erectus came out of Africa, there are now the genomic data telling us they became thoughtful humans like sapiens in the broader Indian subcontinent, which includes like Turkmenistan and then Iraq, Iran, all that area, even Tibet possibly, but rest of South India too. And from they went all over. See, this is a paper from, I think these are Norwegian or Danish authors. I forgot now. I think Sweden. Okay. Anyways, I'm almost done. The cotton domestication, there is evidence in India, like going out of India, Gritsamad and so on. About same time as Mahabharata, okay, a Indian cotton thread or its origin that in India is now found in Israel, okay, going back to about 7,500 years ago. Very fascinating how the science is progressing. Even we can look at a cotton somewhere found around the world and possibly try to decide its origin, okay. But that commerce, I don't know if you knew that. This is my last piece of evidence. So people will say, well, how was this domestication or how was this commerce happening? If I was giving this presentation about 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, I did not have this data that I'm showing you right now, this last one. Pumpuhar, they have found 7 ports, so like right now, this vertical line is where the Pumpuhar port is today, or the Pumpuhar seashore. But this is work of Professor Ramaswamy from 2020 onwards, that actually ports, sophisticated port structures inside the ocean going back to about 20,000 years. And the first port structure was destroyed as the sea levels were rising about 16,000 BC, like 18,000 years. But it could be anywhere from 16,000 to 8,000 because the data is like, under the ocean and not very precise. And then it continued. So they built another port, P2, but the sea levels are rising. So that around 8,000 BC. They built another port, P3. And now we come to the time of Mahabharata. Okay. So between 6,000 BC, 4,000 BC. Guess what? What happened? Not only this rising sea level, remember on the west coast, they rose like 23 meters. Something similar, may not be identical, happened on the east coast because it's a global phenomenon. I showed you 30 data points around the world. Not only it destroyed the port 3, but actually the ingressing water, 15 kilometers. So this place, Mayuram or Mailadithurai, right now is landlocked. But if you would have gone to 55-25 BC, it has become a seaport, and we have evidence of it being a seaport for the next 2,000 years and so on. And then the water is receding. This is exactly same time what's happening in Dwarka. Then the water is receding, and in the next 5,000, 6,000 years, it came to where it is today. Okay, and quickly, and if you think of astronomy, very, very sophisticated Indian astronomy system that you can actually show a lot better than Greeks and going in. But I have gone over my time, so I'm going to stop here. Elliptical orbits, there is sufficient evidence of that in Surya Siddhanta, that they knew that orbits were elliptical. Okay. And this is one of my co-researcher, Rupa Bhatti, we presented at Oxford in 2018, and some of the epochs from Surya here. And last one, people say, hey, you guys, Indians, I would say the criticism, once something is found in modern science, you jump and is there in Mahabharata, Ramayana, Rugu, whatnot. But why don't you make predictions that are not been claimed by modern science yet, and let modern science chase predictions? So Dr. Alin Narayanan, who is a aeronautical engineer, but former ISRO scientist, now in Washington, D.C., he and me published one paper based on Surya Siddhanta, where actually some of the predictions of Surya Siddhanta are truly amazing, and modern astronomy has not caught up with it. If I will be happy to send the papers afterwards, but just because of time, let me stop here. These are my 3 books. They are available on Amazon everywhere. When Did the Mahabharata War Happen? The Historic Rama, Bhishma Nirvana. If you are in India, Subbo publication has published them, slightly different covers. The Historic 12,209, but otherwise the same. And they have been translated, actually many more now than what I'm showing on the screen. They are in the works in Telugu and whatnot, but 2 books are translated in Marathi. The 3rd one is almost complete. One in this one, I think, is Kannada. Okay, and I can't read that. But When Did the Mahabharata War Happen? Okay, that's in Kannada. So with that, I will start my video, and let me see how I did on time. Okay, I might have taken over, Professor Kulkarni.
No, I think this is perfect. Good job of presenting. And since I'm the president, I get the first chance to ask questions. All right. Well, actually, my question is easy. Number one is, well, maybe easy. 2 questions, easy. Number one, where do you get the data of male or female, number of female divided by number of male to that accuracy point? That's my first question. And number 2 question is, are there any doubters of this work? Means, are there people who are questioning you whether this is true or not?
Yeah. So the first question, to get the data. I mean, this data, this paper by Monica Carmin, 2015. And, if you are familiar, most of the genetics papers has like multiple authors, typically, 20, 30, 40, 50. This one has like a 95 authors. One of the reasons one of the reason is many are suppliers of data, because they own the data, right? If they have done sampling in, say, Africa, if they have done sampling in India, so those people are coming together. And there is a combination of modeling also, which is to say they look at the current data and just like we time, temperature superimposition.
Not Indian on this show?
No, they're all Indian.
Of course.
Sorry.
Good.
Ajay is talking somewhere there. Okay. So basically, Professor Kulkarni involved, for example, for the mutation rate and whatnot. Also, when you are connecting curve, like sometimes there may not be a data point in between. So now they have a choice, like a polynomial, setting the polynomial. Like what do? Do you just draw a straight line? Do you draw a smooth curve? So it is there.
Yeah.
But in spite of that, I mean, in spite of the fact that the data is actually very scant, considering we are talking thousands of years and number of samples taken is very low. And that has happened only what? Last 40, 50 years, basically, the genetic thing. In spite of that, the kind of signal that you are seeing is frankly very impressive, for the location, for the timing, and so on. So keep that in mind. It's a modeling, and this Monica Carmen gang has nothing to do with the Mahabharata. They don't even know, that is not even their objective.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And the second question you had was are there doubters? Yeah, of course. I mean, if there are no doubters, then how would this get validated? In fact, I would say there are doubters or there are critic. We want many more. And because, every time a critic comes and tries to pinpoint holes into it, and the evidence is such that it withstands against it, that actually proves the efficacy of the model or efficacy of my claims. So it is happening. I mean, it is happening in last 15 years. My claims are flying with success with every objection from every angle.
Oh, I see. Well, I'm asking that because I do want to share, and I waited this until you are done. But I did get an email from one of your doubters who said, "Well, what Nilesh Oak is saying is not really good. You shouldn't be asking him to present the webinar." And I just told him that's not the way we work. We believe in freedom of, and if there are doubts, you put that in front of him rather than. But then again, there was actually an email, a couple of emails about this webinar presentation. But I told them outright that that's just not the way we want to work in SIA. But in any case, let me pass it on to other people now. And
I got a question. I got a comment.
Yes, please. Yes,
Yeah. It was an interesting talk, and one of the things which fascinated me was this Hinduism was spread in Southeast Asia, but is there, and in fact, I've seen in Angkor Wat temple in Cambodia, Mahabharata was engraved on the walls of the temple, and thousands of years old, And my question is there any evidence of Hinduism spread on east side, where Middle East and other places?
Okay, great question. The one that we see so you mean the west side on the Middle East, right? The east one. Yeah. The east one is like, say, the Cambodia, like the dating I know is like about 1,000 years old. So it's not very late, Yeah. But of course it's there. I mean, Vietnam, if you look at the old names, like, there is literally these are all Indian names, like a Champa, individual provinces as Champa. One of them is a Pandurangi, for example. So East is kind of well known. It still has been preserved in a way. Ayodhya, what is that? Thailand. You see the king there called Rama 1, Rama 2, Rama 3, Rama 4. But let me take you on the west side. Okay. For example, the Balik. Like Balik is actually one of the brother of Shantanu, and or maybe not Shantanu, I may be saying a wrong one. I think I'm right. Balik, Shantanu, and one more. But the point is, as these kingdoms were spreading, sometimes called Balik also changes. So at one point, some grantha we see Balik referring to the area of Iran. But another time we see that Balik is referring to the area of Syria. For example, right now, maybe a coincidence, but I think more than coincidence, there is a river called Balik. And I have been to Syria, by the way, a long time ago. There is a river Balik in Syria. But just with that, and then, if you go back to 4,000 years, there is this evidence of Mitannis and Hittites in the Syria, Jordan, doing the treaties. And in their treaties, they're invoking all the Rigvedic gods, like Nasatya and whatnot. But on the west side, let me pull the evidence from the Western text. For example, Herodotus was there around Greek historian, you can say, about 2,500 years ago, 500 BC. Now, his book is translated as History of the World. Now, the world that he knew, like the Mediterranean. But some things just fast forward. So in that book, if you go to book number 2 and chapter 124 to 145. So 140 to 143, do you know what he says? He went to Egypt. So I'm telling you, Ramayana evidence from Egypt, okay, in the narration. So he goes to Egypt, and think of this as a local tourist guide, for lack of a better word, some local person. He says, he makes him walk along the Nile, and in one place there are 341 statues of different kings. And he says, look, this king is a son of this king is a son of this king, and he goes through that explanation. That is those chapter 124 through 145 in book 2 of Herodotus. Very interestingly, he says each king had about 33 years. So 341 comes to about 11,340 years. That is the Herodotus. For simplicity, we'll take that as 11,500, 11,340 turning to 11,500 for simplicity. Add to that 2,500 years, because that's how many years ago Herodotus was. That adds up to 14,000 years. Now, this is what I'm saying, the timing of Rama. Okay. Now, what is interesting is, if you go to the first chapter 124, he says this first king in the whatever the language, because it is translated from Greek to English, I can only read English. He says he's like a god. It was like I'm just using the word because everyone can understand here. It was a very wonderful altruistic rule. Think of this as a Ramarajya, if you want to call it. But after that, these 341, none of them was a god. They were human beings, he says. And do you know what is the name of that first king that he says that it started 341? He says Ram Sinitos. Sinitos. And then if you come fast forward to Ramesses I, you can see many coincidences like thing. For example, Ramesses I's wife's name, and you can go and check that into the Google, for example. And so just like we have a Rama 1, Rama 3 on the east side, we also have this on the west side. So even in the narrations, we find the references.
Okay. We'll go to Dr. Datta now, and then Dr. Murthy is interested in asking too. So we'll do that sequence. Yes, sir.
Yes. Firstly, thank you, Dr. Oak. It was a very interesting topic. I was thinking what fascinated me, well, many things fascinated me, what you said today, but especially I was fascinated by your mentioning that 4 million people, 4 million soldiers fought in this war. And then I was thinking, from what you have mentioned about the genetics of the Monica Carmen paper, would it be conceptually possible for you to take, or anybody else to take, those dips in the female to male ratio relative to the different areas to find out how many of those 4 million came from India itself, and how many of them in percentage terms were from the Syria population or from the Indonesia population? So you would have a breakup of what constituted the different areas of the people as part of the armies.
Yeah. No, great question. Now, keep in mind, we are talking 7,500 years ago, and we have a lot of assumptions about the total population and whatnot. If you go to Google, and there are like 8 or 10 different people who have made these estimates. And I have given some talks where I show those estimates also. The estimates range from like a 2 million to 50 million. And some estimates are like 5 to 20 million. Okay? Just as an intuition, I'm going to take the number 20. Keep that in mind. It's a very crude approximation. And I'll show you. I will show you how that 16:1, but especially 5:1 ratio also matches. Okay, because you saw 17 divided by 3.
Yes.
Imagine the world population, because we don't know exactly how it was, from 2 million to 50 million, and those are even estimates. Let's say the world population was 20 million. I'm making it a very crude way to explain it. Imagine out of 20 million, the 10 million population was from the areas who did not participate in the Mahabharata War. which is to say only 10 million were related to the Mahabharata.
Potential. Right.
Potential. From Syria to say Indonesia, just like the map I showed you. Now, if there are 10 million people there, just a simple kind of approximation is 5 million men, 5 million women.
Right. 50-50.
Again, I'm making a very crude one. So because I don't want you to people trying to tooth comb and say, what about the old people and the young people? Because then we can take a bigger number.
Yeah. Right.
But now imagine, so now we have 5 million men, 5 million women who were in the area where the Mahabharata war kind of got affected, people coming from there. Now, out of that, imagine 4 million, so 5 million men, out of that 4 million men, which is what I said, 18 Okshweni, and Mahabharata confirms that, suddenly gone in 18 days. So just as a pure population number, female to male, we have a 5:1. Now, if you think of it as a ratio.
Right.
Which is what
5
happened.
million.
Now, this is, I'm just giving it as an intuition way to understand it. In reality, do understand that when they talk of 16:1 or 5:1, they're not talking of the human population, the female to male population, but they're talking the variation
The chromosomes.
in their chromosomes. Right. But by taking those numbers, which are still within the range estimated as a population, which is to say 5 to 50 million, we can still even explain just showing the population that's very reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Murthy will be the next, and then Dr. Kothari will get a chance to. Good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Oak, for a fascinating and very scholarly presentation of interesting facts. I wanted to ask you about the dating of the Srimad Bhagavatam, because that is a story, that's the biography of Krishna in some sense.
Yes.
And what your evidence shows, if you've done any research on that, and many scholars have dated it as post-Buddhistic because Buddha appears as one of the incarnations, Dasavatara in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So they say that's evidence that it has to be after Buddha's advent. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Question number one. Question number two is whether you have dated or anyone of your colleagues has dated the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, because there's a lot of contention about the dates on that one too. And that also signifies a major development in the Indian philosophical tradition. And my third question is, with all these evidences about these datings, what philosophical implications does it have with respect to modern society?
Very good. Okay, so I will start, and then if I forget the question, you just have to give me a hint on what that question is. The first one on the Bhagavad Puran. Now, Bhagavad Puran is a Smriti literature, like a Purana category, which means they are updated when required. Okay, unlike say Rigveda, and even the Rigveda was updated. Like there is a reference in Mahabharata that Vyasa recasted, re-edited. But even if we keep that aside, so what to speak of Buddha? We actually have even the references to Mahapadmananda in Bhagavad Puran. And so they are added, so they're supposed to be added because it's a Smriti literature, which is to say we update with time, just like we may update a Vanshavali, the genealogy and so on. So that has happened. So your question was related to Krishna, but also the timing of it. So what we can do based on what is available, like astronomy evidence available in Bhagavad Puran, that definitely it was composed, which I doubt, because based on at least the narration, it says Vyasa composed it. So that will have to go back to 7,500 years ago, but not all the Bhagavata that we see today. But based on the astronomy evidence, we can say that at least one of the update, if not the original compilation, occurred about 1300 BCE, 1300 to 1600 BCE. So there is the evidence in Bhagavad Puran that can tell us that it was either compiled as a worst case scenario or the best case scenario. It was at least updated once around that time. That is not to say it was not updated after, but they did not put some reference that can allow us to tell us that. Now, Krishna's biography, If we want to put it together, the Bhagavad Puran is not sufficient. Actually, we have to use Mahabharata, we have to use Harivansha and Bhagavad Puran. And I would encourage all of you to watch my multiple talks, the biography of Krishna and whatnot, where I have shown, see, I did not know that Madhvacharya had come up with his own estimate or own number for Krishna's lifetime called 107 years. I did not know that until I used Mahabharata, I used Bhagavad Puran and Harivansha evidence and came up with using astronomy and chronology to come up at 107 years. 633 BC to 5525 BC. And when I published that, or I actually gave a talk on it, somebody from Australia of an Indian origin, one Mr. Shastri, he brought it to my attention that Madhvacharya, who is from what, 12th, 13th century, in his Tatparya Nirnay, had written that Bhagwan Krishna lived for 107 years. Saptamabdam Shatottaram. So there is a very nice, wonderful coincidence matching that. And I don't know how Madhvacharya did it. What was your second question?
Oops. My second question had to do with the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which are also contested as to being relatively recent origin. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. We unfortunately don't have anything in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra that can allow us to date it. So there are some indirect references people have tried, like a Patanjali, Patanchal, from Sanskrit, from Upanishad text. But there is a speculation involved that if Patanchal is same as Patanjal and so on and so forth, if that is so, then that may go to the Mahabharata times, but there is a speculation involved. So I would say we don't have a very solid evidence to decide where exactly it was composed.
And there's the famous Vyasa Bhashya, which is the definitive commentary on the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And there's also a debate whether that Vyasa Bhashya was written by Vyasa of the Mahabharata or Vyasa of a later time.
Okay, my understanding is it's a Vyasa of a later times, like, anyone who expanded. So whether by means of commentary or by means of expansion, like, Vyasa means like a Vistar. In that sense, they were also called Vyasa. I don't think it is the same like Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa of a Mahabharata, but that's just my thinking on it.
And my last question was, what are the philosophical and cultural implications of your research?
That's a great question. Actually, huge implications. Because see, for example, if one understands Mahabharata happening 7,500 years ago, Ramayana 14,000 years ago, Rigveda 21,000 years ago, everything in Sanskrit, whether a Rigvedic Sanskrit or a classical Sanskrit, what people would call a very sophisticated navigation, like the evidence I showed you, very sophisticated astronomy going back to 40,000 years. I did not go through that because of time. I quickly showed the slides. And this is all Sanskrit based, basically. I mean, Sanskrit based in the sense of ornamentology. For example, the names of the characters, the whole cultural scenario is Sanskrit. So basically, Aryan invasion nonsense gets squashed. I mean, we don't need to even discuss. We shouldn't be discussing in the place, but even if you want to discuss, that just goes away. And again, in that tetradic schema, we have to ask now, so what else are we missing? Because last 300 years, we are stuck into Indian civilization to be what, 3,500 years old or 5,000 years old. And suddenly now we have a huge vista of very comfortably going back to 25,000 years. But actually, I showed like briefly 75,000 years. So in a way, the ingredients that we need for a very sophisticated civilization, like a water, weather, forest, animals, domestication, agriculture, is there for a very long time. And now we have to look for additional evidence to say what is the origin of a language, and I wouldn't be surprised. Actually, in my subjective judgment, I do think the Rigvedic language goes back to the origin of a language for humanity. I mean, that's how, but a lot of work needs to happen, and I'm not a linguist by any stretch of imagination. So it increases so many possibilities. And I don't know if you have seen Professor Murthy, my what is that podcast with Ranveer? If you have, I'm not the first one, by the way, but I became famous on standing on other people's shoulders. I have shown the connection between India and Latin America, going back to Ramayana times, 14,000 years plus, and even beyond that, the Bali and Vamana and those times and so on. Very fascinating. So it opens up like what we don't know. And philosophical in terms of philosophy itself, but in terms of the whole story of humanity. So we are, or I or myself or with my co-researchers, our focus is exploring the story of India, but actually it is turning out to be the story of humanity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Well, we'll have a question from Dr. Tiwari.
Kothari.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. This is very interesting, Dr. Oak. I was really fascinated by it. Of course, I've been fascinated by it for a long time. This basically, to take off on your last comment and Dr. Murthy's question, this Battle of 10 Kings that occurred, I don't know if you have actually, I think that you did mention that. Is it possible that some of those tribes that were defeated by our 10 tribes were defeated by one, some of them, say, Asura tribe, are the ones that were kind of asked to leave India, or they decided to leave, or they went west and founded Assyria, etc. And of course, we know Ahur Mazda, the Iranian thing, and also even in Iran they have this king, last king that we had, Pahlavi. Now that's sounds very similar to Pallav in India, in Indian stories, history and stuff. Is it possible? So I mean, this is really quite interesting that it is quite possible that the birth of civilization, birth of human consciousness, human history, human knowledge actually occurred in India. And then many of these things went west, including, of course, Europe too, but including that. And we do know that the Chinese history was approximately 2500 BC onwards. And Egyptian maybe 3500 BC onwards. But our history seems to be, thousands of years older than that. So is it possible? So this really, changes the focus of the entire world in the sense that maybe India is the birthplace for civilization. It is very, very interesting. I mean, I have like 4 or 5 questions, but that is the first one. If you can answer that, and the other one, of course, is about Ramasetu, and then about
let me make let me make a comment on this, okay?
Yes.
Because you have opened, like, that itself is a very big question.
Right.
I'll just summarize a short one, but I will encourage you to read my blogs also, books if you're interested, but we'll definitely watch the talks also by Rupa Bhati. But so just let me start with where you started. Just keep in mind that Indian antiquity is going deep. Not that only Indian antiquity is going deep. For example, see, the Egypt, I said, when Herodotus goes there and somebody showing him 341 statues, talking a history of about 14,000 years from today, which means they had some connections. They may be Indian connections, but they were there in Egypt even 14,000 years ago. I mean, Herodotus was only 2,500 years ago. So keep that in mind. If you go to agriculture in Jordan, Syria area, I'm not getting the name now. It starts with the N. This research was done in 1928 by a British lady scientist. And actually, she found a very phenomenal evidence there for a established agriculture going back to 15,000 years in Jordan and Syria. And then if you go on the east side to the Hamon or Jamon, whatever the way they say it, pottery in Japan, and you see the same pottery, that pottery goes back to 15,000 years, okay, in Japan. And you see the same pottery in Ecuador, that's called Waldia culture. Literally, I mean, if I have given talks on it, if you show the Waldia pottery from Ecuador, you will look at it and right now you'll say, oh, that's Japanese. And now the dating of that Waldia pottery goes back up to like 6,000 years. They have not found anything. So my point is there are evidence of antiquity in human civilization, human presence around the world, not just India. But to coming to your point, I talked about the domestic mouse, which is going back 10+ years. Now that's like agriculture going out. You look at the zebu cow, they are going out post Mahabharata migrations. I mean, the evidence that is there, I quickly skimmed over it. That talks about the post Mahabharata, like 5,500, 3,500 BCE, zebu cow going out of India. That is what the evidence they are finding. So yes, there are definitely significant influences going out of India. But my point is, I mean, I put it in a simple way. I say, if you go back 4,000 years, there is no us versus them. Because, just like we go to America and we come back, now I'm spending significant time in India in 6 months. So there was an exchange of people back and forth also. So people must be learning from all over, and we see these descriptions into Mahabharata, we see these descriptions into Ramayana, we see these descriptions into even Bhagavad, where the living standards of people outside India of that times, like Bharatvarsha, Jambudvip, whatever they called it, even in Mahabharata, Sanjay tells Dhritarashtra that some places in the world where the living standards of people is better than India. Okay, there are descriptions like that, Hari Varsha or something he says. So it was basically the way global village is kind of like that we have now. But definitely there is enough evidence to show, especially looking at astronomy, navigation, language, grammar, and so on, that India was a huge contributor. That much we can definitely say. Thank you.
Very good. Well, we will go to a last question because we are running out of time now. And Ravi Sharma has raised his hand. So Ravi, would you please introduce yourself first and then ask a quick question?
Yes. I'm thankful to Dr. Kothari for sending me a link that I saw just 5-10 minutes ago. So I joined you. Therefore, first my apologies to Nilesh Oak, speaker, that I could not listen live your presentation. I hope that this recording would be available so we can review.
It will be on our website. It will be on our website in a week or so.
I'm a nuclear particle space physicist, enterprise architect, a board of ontology trustee, and the first Indian, as far as I know, to receive Apollo Achievement Award for putting man on moon in NASA. 1969.
Great.
And I set up a lot of things in ISRO as number 2 man, who started ISRO headquarters construction and layover at Bangalore. I was scientific secretary. With this introduction, I have one comment. I used to read during my master's studies in Mumbai, now on Bombay at that time. So there were 2 books that I used to see at that time. I don't have them now. It was 60 some years ago. Bhikkhu Chamanlal. Chamanlal or Chamanlal is one. And the second one is Eric von Daniken or some Netherlands. Or
yes.
These 2 refer to glyphs, Brahmi type or language image similarities between South America, Egypt, and India. Did you refer to that in your talk today or earlier?
No. Okay.
And what are your thoughts about that work?
Okay. So Chamanlal, Chamanlal or whatever his first name, but Chamanlal, I'm familiar with his book. I read the book a while ago. I became familiar with Chamanlal's work through another researcher, Raviji. I don't know if you have heard the name, Dr. P.V. Vartak. He was based in Pune. So through him, through Vartak, I became familiar with Chamanlal because Vartak refers to Chamanlal. And so I did not refer to, I didn't refer to Chamanlal or Vartak, just to keep the time constraint. I didn't always quoted the specific people. But I learned a lot from Vartak, so that was it. And so some of the connections that I made into Latin America, and I have taken that research way further. One of my co-researcher, Mitra Desai, she is based in Australia. She has taken it even further. For example, just because you ask, I will tell you, which was not known to me or even anybody in before. But Ramayana describes the Andes as a Udaya Parvata, the rising mountain or rising sun mountain. It is the Ananta, So the trident that is there in the Peru, it says it is the insignia of Ananta. So this is point from Ramayana. Now, Ramayana doesn't say Patal, but now if you go to Bhagavad Puran says Ananta is a mountain in the Patal, is a mountain range in the Patal. Okay? The Patal is like a South America, this is what Chamanlal said and many others have said. I agree with that. Now comes Mitra Desai, and after my research, she took it further and she showed actually there are 4 to 5 peaks in the Andes and they are named Ananta. And that did not occur in the last 500, 600 years after Spaniards went to Latin America. How fascinating is that? So slowly but surely these points are coming together. So that's my answer to that.
If I may ask before we depart, is it, do you know or have you been in touch with Michael Danino? And
yeah, Michel Danino, yes.
It's a very interesting book. I read it from top to bottom.
Yeah.
And the last thing is, is it possible to get your email, and also since I'm in DC area, Mr. Anil Narayan's email?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So what I will do is, since you may have a common group, I will share my email, and I mean, Kulkarni ji already has it, and Anil Narayanji's email also with him, and then he can share with anyone who is interested.
Okay.
So Anil Narayanji is right there, and let me make a point on the Michel Danino's work. Like a number of you might have read Lost River.
Yes.
So Lost River is an amazing book for this one aspect. And I will tell you for what it is a wrong book also. The amazing book, because in the last, say 300, 400 years, maybe 500 years, what Michel Danino has done amazing research from the documents of Western Europeans who were here in India for one or the other, is that in the social memory, that Saraswati was very much living and in a very specific way, like in Rajasthan and in Haryana, and people knew some river, hey, this is they call Saraswati and so on, which is very fascinating. Where the correction is required, and I have told Michel Danino-ji, but for some reason he doesn't, which is fine by me, because there is a sufficient evidence, is if you have read the second chapter of that wonderful book, The Lost River, this is like written when 2010 or so. So there he has put forward this proposal or the theory that this Saraswati River started flowing as if 10,000 years ago.
Yes.
And the modern research that shows that forget 10,000 years ago, actually Saraswati was almost a non-existent river. It was still there 10,000 years ago. The glorious river of Rigveda that is described in Rigveda, the Saraswati, for that we have to go at least 25,000 years ago. So the grand Saraswati that we are talking, that James Blinkhorn's work, Mary Corti, Frank Frankfurt, Peter Cliff, this is all showing going to antiquity of Saraswati, going back to 40,000, 50,000, 100,000 and 200,000 years. So there is a huge gap between what he's saying in terms of its antiquity. So that's the point I think we need to have asked that to Michel. Passed away now. So I was with Mitra, and I asked him. So I said, there is evidence for this 50,000 that time, 2017. why everyone saying 10,000? And he just smiled at me. I don't know what to
No,
make of that. But there
I
are
can
corrections.
reply to that.
Please go ahead.
After you finish your
No, I'm
thought.
done. I'm done.
I've done a lot of work on Saraswati, directly and indirectly through remote sensing. And in 1972 first, and looking at ERTS 1 and 2 images of India, which was printed paper. At those days, we didn't have these nice displays and monitors. So I was at Michigan at that time for a year away from NASA headquarters, just to study remote sensing to bring some benefit to India. As I was returning, Vikram Sarabhai had brought me back. So I walked over those papers, and please remember, from Himalayas, one branch flows and goes towards Ghaggar River, goes through Nagaur, etc. of Rajasthan, and goes to Indus River and merges during floods these days. But 10,000 years ago, trace is the second branch which goes through Marubhumi or Registan, through Rajasthan, goes all the way, meets near Dwarka area, that Ran of Kutch Dwarka area. And you all know that because of desertification about 10-20,000 years ago, the Thar Desert was born. This is recent geology. Deeper geology, as you say, that these channels might be buried for 20-30,000 years, but 10,000 is mentioned for desertification reasons. This is my take on Saraswati. I have also done with Dr. Fateh Singh, who deciphered Brahmi, with him work in Jodhpur on this Saraswati River.
Actually, Michael Danino is saying that Saraswati River started disappearing because of tectonic shift after 2900 BC. And I think Dr. Dr. Oakes, are more or less not saying that didn't happen. What you're saying is that its beginning was much older than.
Correct.
Right,
Yeah. So
and
by
I think
3000 BC, it was complete disappearance is 3000
Yes.
BC or that time.
right.
But the what you can say, the degradation of a Saraswati or losing its Rigvedic status, that happened a very long time ago.
Oh.
And that's why all the people who migrated from there are known as Saraswats and God Saraswats.
Correct.
They are all the way down to south.
True.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I know we are way about designated time, but that was for the good reason. I think this was wonderful. I'm very happy that we invited you. This was fascinating discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
And we hope to keep in touch. If you are not a member of SIA, we invite you to be a member. Please send your email address to Gaurav Panta, who sends, he keeps up with the email list. So make sure he gets your email for the future webinar invitations. They will be listed on SIA us.com, our website. And thank you very much for being here. I think it was wonderful that you all came, and it was a very lively discussion. I do thank Dr. Oak to be here, who was here. We'll see you again next month when we have another webinar coming up.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night and good day. Bye.